all the time.
We are family.
Outstanding effort again.
We're busting ours to kick yours.
That's big time.
-15.
Respect all, fear none.
Oh, did he belt that one?
Intensity is not a perfume.
It was a no-doubter.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are up in the bird's nest here at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. I'm Brendan Mortensen, joined via Zoom by Annie Klaff. Usually I'm the one on the road, but Annie just made a trip down to Norfolk to visit the AAA Norfolk Tides and is currently in a Barnes & Noble in the middle of Virginia because we are dedicated to getting you the bird's nest under any circumstances whatsoever, even if you are surrounded by a bunch of children trying to buy stuffed animals, as Annie is right now.
Yeah, we like to keep people on their toes for this bird's nest. I don't know when the last time we had a bird's nest where both of us were in person. And I don't know when the next one will be also, because I think you are on the road again next week. So we like to keep you all on their toes. And I am also keeping the customers of Barnes & Noble on their toes as I talk about the Norfolk Tides and the Orioles.
Yeah, all of the customers who have walked into Barnes & Noble unassumingly on a Wednesday did not know that they were getting one half of the bird's nest just right there in front of them. So, you know, it's really a treat for all those folks just trying to find a good book here on a Wednesday morning. But
Exactly.
Annie, unfortunately, we have to start yet another podcast with an injury update. I say it every single week. I don't want the bird's nest to exclusively become what Orioles injury is next up. But unfortunately, that's where we are today. And we're going to talk about the catching situation. Obviously, with you just being down in Norfolk, we're going to talk Samuel Basayo and the future of the Orioles catching position here, at least for the next few weeks, in the absence of Adley Rutschman, who hits the injured list with a lat strain. Tony Mansolino says he is going to be out until at least after the break. Quite honestly, this injury couldn't have come at a worse time for the Orioles or for Adley Rutschman. The Orioles kind of go as Adley Rutschman goes. We have talked about it a lot. When Adley Rutschman plays well, the Orioles tend to play well. It has been that way since he made his debut a few seasons ago. And the Orioles were really picking things up in June, and it was because Adley Rutschman was playing so well, in large part. He was hitting over 300. The OPS was close to 900, just 8 strikeouts, 7 walks. It was kind of vintage Adley Rutschman, and it's no surprise that that coincided with the Orioles winning a lot more baseball games. So just unfortunate timing on an individual level for Adley Rutschman, and then unfortunate timing for the Orioles as a whole as well, because he is locked into that number 2 spot in the lineup, and he is really a big reason why this team has been going well as of late.
Right, and it's really unfortunate for him as well, too, because he had a very rough start to 2025, a guy that had a lot of really high expectations just given how his spring training went and how the end of last season went, where it really looked like he was going to come into 2025 with a fire, and it wasn't necessarily that. The underlying metrics still looked really good. We talked about that week in, week out on the podcast. But we were really just starting to see it translate for him, which, like you mentioned, the batting average, the OPS close to 900 in those last 15 games before getting that MRI is really upsetting for this to happen, for him to hit the injured list. It also, you mentioned timing. It is a little bit kind of a two sides of the coin there, where it's really rough timing for the Orioles and them kind of getting into a groove and him getting into a groove. You are lucky, though, at the same time that you did get Gary Sanchez back when you did, because if not, then that also would have been an even deeper hole that the Orioles catching situation would have gotten into. So you're glad you have Gary Sanchez back. He has been really good since coming back from the IL in 8 games. He's above 1,100 OPS. But with Adley, it is a very rough few days that he had just before hitting the injured list. Obviously, there was that really scary situation with Hunter Biggie in Tampa, and then he hits the IL. So you are thinking of him, hopefully, when they said that it would just be after the All-Star break. It seems like a pretty decent timeline for him to come back. You obviously wouldn't have wanted anything worse. So at least after the All-Star break, hopefully it can be like right after the break.
Yeah, and the break is just tough timing, too, because you're getting right up to the trade deadline. And I think for this team, you know, the elephant in the room is that, yeah, they are hopefully making a playoff push. They are turning things around. This team is playing a lot better baseball, and they are far from out of it in the wild card race. And of course, the end of the season is the deadline for whether or not the goals for this team ultimately end up coming to fruition. But there is still the looming trade deadline at the end of July, where if the Orioles are, we don't know how many games under 500 they would have to be for this team to consider, moving some guys potentially on expiring contracts, getting some prospects back. It's something we have talked about in the past as a possibility, but this team had so much momentum over the past few weeks that it felt like, okay, if they are close to 500 by the time the trade deadline rolls around, even a few games under 500, it's hard to see this team selling because there's a belief in that clubhouse that when this team is healthy and they are playing the baseball that they are capable of playing, that there's no reason they should sell at the deadline because they can make a playoff push and potentially make some noise down the stretch. But missing a guy like Adley Rutschman for as long as you are now, that is a really tough task to get to the trade deadline and be in the place where you want to be. Now, obviously, the Orioles have dealt with a lot more compounding injuries than that over the past few weeks. When you talk about missing Colton Cowser and Jordan Westberg and Tyler O'Neill and this guy and that guy, those injuries have piled up. And right now, the Orioles are still relatively healthy. I know Jordan Westberg has missed the last few games, but he avoids an injured list stint. And, you mentioned Gary Sanchez coming back and playing some good baseball behind the dish. That's really good timing there, especially with Adley Rutschman going down. But it's just a lot of things to have to overcome over the next few weeks when that trade deadline, it's not a point that you look at to say, okay, the season's going this way or that way, but what the Orioles end up doing at that deadline is going to be really indicative of what this second half is going to look like. And not having Adley Rutschman for this push to get there is just a tough blow to the momentum.
Right, and it's definitely, you mentioned how it's somewhat still a healthy lineup. It still feels like it's one of the healthiest this lineup has been all season, which is really sad to say.
Yeah.
It says a lot, but just even with this, they still look pretty healthy throughout the lineup, but missing Adley Rutschman is a big blow to that lineup. And even when this guy has gotten a lot of flack this year, where he had some guys saying, okay, bench him, option him, which the coaches knew they weren't going to pay attention to. They had faith in him. They had faith in him to keep him in the number 2 spot, and it ended up paying its dividends because look at how well he started to perform when he had that trust and confidence that was set in stone in him to stay in that number 2 spot. So it really is just a tough blow to the team, but also, like you mentioned, the momentum, because that could change things. You have no idea with how sustainable it's going to be with Gary Sanchez. Yesterday, he had a few mistakes at catching. He hasn't necessarily been the best defensively. He has given a little bit of a thump offensively, but not necessarily on the defensive side of things. Maverick Hanley was another guy who was surprisingly pretty solid at defense. In behind the dish, he was 2 blocks above average. That's in the 60th percentile. Adley, for perspective, only had 1, and Gary with -3 or -3. So I think that Maverick Hanley is probably just as much of a blow as Adley Rutschman when it comes to depth. So this lineup is definitely going to be going through it. You just hope that they have the momentum. It looked pretty decent last night. I know it was an extra innings loss, but at least it was a close loss and not a big blowout one. So you just hope that you can keep the momentum, hope that the offense can keep trying to get healthier. Jordan Westberg coming back is going to be huge, as it always is. But you just really cannot lose track of this momentum right now.
Yeah, we're going to get to the Maverick Hanley injury there in a minute because that's another blow to this Orioles catching depth, as you mentioned. But last point I want to make there on Adley, I'm very curious to see what the lineup construction looks like, because in kind of the modern era of lineup construction, you want to go, left, right, switch hitter as often as you can. Making those guys kind of, left, right. It makes sense when you are looking at how a lot of teams manage their bullpen, because you don't want to give the opposing manager an opportunity where you've got 3 left-handed hitters in a row in your lineup, and so they can just throw a left-handed reliever late in a game and have an easy pocket to get those 3 guys out. Adley Rutschman, being a very talented switch hitter, just fits so seamlessly into that number 2 spot for the Orioles, where you could go Jackson Holiday leadoff, Adley Rutschman switch hitter batting second, Gunnar Henderson batting third. That was kind of the 1-2-3 that was carrying the top of this offense in June. And then you had a right-handed hitter batting cleanup usually, maybe Ramon Laureano, and then Ryan O'Hearn batting fifth. That was kind of the 1 through 5, and it made a lot of sense because Adley was there hitting second for you. And right now, you don't have a natural right-handed hitter to hit second at this point that is really tearing the cover off the ball. Ramon Laureano has been playing good baseball. Ramon Arias we have seen in that 2 spot too, but it does kind of change the lineup construction if Tony Mansolino wants to continue to try to go, left, right, left at the top of this lineup. Holiday's 1 and Gunnar Henderson is 3, and now the second spot in that lineup is a little bit up for grabs, and there's not really anybody who's a natural fill-in for that spot.
Right, that's a really good point that you make, Brendan, because I feel like with Adley, just given his switch hitting ability, just given what he's meant to this clubhouse for the last however many years, that he's been part of this identity, is he would be an everyday player. Sure, he could get some days off if he's not catching or just a designated hitter, but he is someone that was designed to be in the lineup every single day, and you don't necessarily have that. I mean, who knows with Jordan Westberg if you wanted to fill him in the number 2 spot? I don't know exactly how many appearances he's had in that number 2 spot. But if you wanted to get a consistent right-handed bat in there, you would think maybe you could throw him in there. But obviously right now his health is also a big question mark. And you don't know how long it's going to take for him to get back after jamming his finger into second base. So that is a really good point because you don't necessarily have that kind of consistency in that lineup that you would have gotten from Adley. And it's another curveball that's getting thrown at Tony Mansolino. He's had many of them thrown at him this season. And I'm sure that he is still getting to learn the ropes of lineup construction. And this just definitely doesn't make it any easier for him.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think Jordan Westberg is probably your 2 hitter once he gets back from injury. Again, avoids the injured list stint, but is still out for the past few days here. But if he's your 2 hitter, then you need somebody batting cleanup if you are trying to protect Ryan O'Hearn batting 5th and Gunnar Henderson batting 3rd. So it's all just kind of a domino effect here, losing Adley Rutschman. And then you mentioned too, Maverick Hanley goes down with injury, and he was the replacement for Adley once Adley hit the injured list. Maverick Hanley comes up, plays, about 2 innings of baseball, and then has that crazy collision with Jazz Chisholm on the play at the plate and lands on the concussion IL. So Maverick Hanley, you mentioned the value that he brings defensively. He has been talked up a lot by guys like Charlie Morton for the quality of game that he calls and just solid defense behind the dish. Not providing you a ton of value offensively, but it's still a valuable backup catcher, kind of third catcher to have in Maverick Hanley. And now you're left with Gary Sanchez and Chadwick Tromp, who kind of does a similar thing to Maverick Hanley. Some good defense there from Chadwick Tromp as well. But it's not the ideal catching situation at this point because you obviously think that you were going to have Adley Rutschman 5-6 days a week. Gary Sanchez is somebody that can fill in, catch twice a week for him, be your designated hitter if you need a right-hander in that spot as well. And now all of a sudden you're talking about Gary Sanchez catching 4 or 5 times a week, backed up by Chadwick Tromp, and it's not the catching situation you thought you would be having at this point in the season.
Right, and it's a lot of maneuvering, which is what this season has been a lot of. It's a lot of what last season has been as well, and it's kind of just the name of the game right now for the Baltimore Orioles, which is unfortunate. And like you mentioned, you just really don't want to have the bird's nest be an injury conversation, but that's the way it is right now. And the really sad part about Maverick Hanley, too, is he just really built up a name for himself just as a guy, as a normal human being, too, because he's just a really great guy, and obviously you don't want to see injuries happen to anyone. Same with Adley, but with Maverick Hanley, I know people were upset when he got brought back down when Gary Sanchez came back, and then you were excited to see him come back and get another opportunity, but did not go the way that he planned. So obviously hoping that this concussion protocol and injured list is just going to be nothing too bad. I hope you're the truck behind me.
Yeah, I'm laughing at the free advertisement that we just gave here on the Bird's Nest. But yeah, Maverick Hanley made a good name for himself. He did the little things well, which I think people appreciated, especially in kind of this era of baseball where some of the small ball stuff is maybe a little bit lost. Maverick Hanley, sack bunt here, a sack fly there, did the little things well, played good defense, and had an outstanding personality. So we're hoping for a speedy recovery for him. Right,
and like you mentioned with the Charlie Morton relationship, too, where it seemed like he was catching for Morton a lot of the time. It was kind of similar to with James McCann last year, where he kind of was the designated guy for Corbin Burns. And just to have that relationship there where you build that foundation with a specific pitcher is huge. I know Adley, any pitcher would feel the same way with Adley, but with Hanley, it was a really good sign for him to kind of make that name for himself as well. So hopefully Sanchez can be that same way. Trump can get some more opportunities. I know he had a double on Monday night, so that's good news for him. I think everybody in the Orioles lineup recorded a hit, which is huge. So hopefully you can get some more out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is going to be a heavy lift for him because this is not, Chadwick Trump and somebody like Luis Vasquez, who is kind of your de facto backup shortstop infielder guy at this point. They played two very different roles because Chadwick Trump is going to have to play. And that's just not how the catching position works in this era of baseball. You need two catchers that are consistently going to play. So Luis Vasquez is somebody you can have up here, and he's a defensive replacement. He can come in the later innings. Chadwick Trump is going to get starts. So that's where the Orioles are with their catching situation at this point. They also signed Jacob Stallings to a minor league deal, had an 810 OPS with the Rockies last year, having a bit of a down 2025, but has just, been around the block. Wouldn't be surprised if he works his way into the fold in this Orioles catching situation, but he's at AAA Norfolk for now. And Andy, on this catching situation, I think the question that most Orioles fans are asking now with two injuries in this, catching position for the Orioles is why not Samuel Basallo? And so I'll kind of leave the floor to you here because you just had the opportunity to talk with Basallo down at AAA Norfolk. And I think if you look at the stats, you're going, okay, it's an OPS right around 950 in AAA, 15 homers, and he's only 20 years old. I mean, this is the youngest player at that level, and he's mashing. So on the one hand, it's why not give him a shot? On the other hand, he's still the youngest player in AAA Norfolk. He hasn't caught a ton of games this year. So what did you learn in your conversation with the skipper down there, with Samuel Basallo, in your time at Norfolk?
Right. I mean, when you look at just his stats right now, it's easy to say, okay, well, why not bring up Samuel Basallo? This guy is absolutely mashing. He's exactly as advertised from when he first came into the organization. And it's really hard to forget about the offensive numbers. But at the same time, when you look at those offensive numbers, there is absolutely no problem when he makes contact. The issue is when he doesn't make contact, because there is some chase there. I mean, in fastballs specifically, he's chasing 36.4% of the time, at least before the game yesterday. But it was interesting, too, when I asked Tim Fedorovich, the new manager in Norfolk, there about that. And he said, look, what makes Samuel Basallo the hitter that he is aggressive. And there's not going to be any changing to that. Obviously, as he matures and gets some more at-bats under his belt against AAA pitchers, and that's going to change, and he starts to refine a little bit more about what he's swinging at and what he's not, because obviously I think if there's one thing that can change or improve on his offensive game, it's going to be the swing decisions, because there's no problem when he makes contact, it's going to go out of the park pretty much. But with Fedorovich, he said, look, you can't necessarily change the aggression with this guy. That's not necessarily the issue. You just got to give him some more time and some more at-bats and some more opportunity to learn these pitchers, because yes, you can refine that a little bit, but also just getting some more reps is the name of the game. And the same goes for his defense. Up until yesterday, it was only 16 appearances behind the dish for him this season at AAA. He didn't get that much time at AAA last season as well. Obviously started this season with a bit of an injury too. So there's just a lot to be done still. And the 20 years old is a huge part of that. There's a lot to be done, especially because you are calling the game as a catcher. That's a lot of responsibility. And for a guy who's only 20 years old, he hasn't had that much opportunity to do so in the highest level in the minor leagues before getting up to the big leagues. So one thing that Fedorovich mentioned that he just needs to, what they're starting to work on right now is that game calling aspect, the kind of leadership aspect behind the dish. So I think that there's a lot to be said for getting some more repetitions at this age in AAA level for him.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing, is he's still really young, and there's two sides to that coin, right? You can look at that, and you look at the offensive numbers, and you look at where the OPS and the home run numbers are. You say, man, he's doing this as the youngest player in AAA. That's right. Unbelievable. Like, he should be up here. He should be doing it at the big league level, but he's the youngest player in AAA, and he hasn't spent a ton of time there yet. And there are things that are just going to come with time. I think you can talk about something like the chase rates on fastballs and say it doesn't seem to be hurting his numbers very much, considering the OPS is right around 950. But if that is something he needs to work on down there, that's an issue that is going to get blown up a lot more than that at the big league level. Big league pitchers will find those weaknesses and they will crank them up to another level. If you had those weaknesses in AAA, of course, as a left-handed hitter for Basayo too, there aren't really, the expression is that there are no AAA left-handed pitchers, because if you are a good left-handed pitcher, you just tend to get the call up to the big leagues a lot quicker and you don't spend a ton of time at the AAA level. So Samuel Basayo probably has not faced a lot of great left-handed pitching competition, but really you're nitpicking if you're looking at the offensive numbers.
Right.
And I know that's what I'm kind of doing here is you're talking about the fastball chase rate. You're talking about, maybe he hasn't faced the toughest lefties in the world. Yeah. Okay. The OPS is 950 and he is the youngest player at that level. That's still outstanding. But I think just from the conversations, you hear how young he is. I remember a few weeks ago when Jordan Westberg came back and he was asked about Samuel Basayo. He said, man, he's got a ton of power, but he's young. And he repeated, he is young about 3 times. He's got some things to work on and he's going to figure it out. And Westberg said he's got so much talent and he is going to figure it out, but he's still really, really young. And I think that is indicative of what this situation is for the Orioles right now, which is that you're not going to rush him just because there are injuries. And it reminds me a little bit of the Jackson Holliday situation last year, where it's a little bit different because Holliday was pushing to make the team out of spring training. Samuel Basayo gets injured in this year's spring training, but even if he was fully healthy, I don't think there's really a scenario where he was pushing for a major league roster spot right out of camp. He needed to go to AAA and prove some things there. He hadn't put up great numbers like Holliday did. But last season, Holliday doesn't make the team out of camp, and then there's an injury early on, and Jackson Holliday gets called up, and he really, really struggles early on, even as the best prospect in baseball at that point. And Mike Elias was kind of the first one to say, hey, it's kind of on me. I feel like I maybe called him up too early, put too much pressure on him. And there would be a different amount of pressure on Basayo. He's not the top prospect in baseball, and his last name's not Holliday. So it's not going to be the same sort of situation that Jackson Holliday went through last year. But I do think there's something to be said for the fact that if the front office feels like they rushed Jackson Holliday a little bit last year because there was an injury and because they felt like he could contribute even at 20 years old, and that didn't go as they thought it would and hoped it would, then maybe that's a cautionary tale for somebody like Samuel Basayo, where the numbers are outstanding. And yeah, he's a young phenom with a really bright future ahead of him. But we just saw the Orioles maybe push a 20-year-old prospect a little bit further ahead than he should have been. And they're not going to do that again just because there is an injury here for what is hopefully only 4 to 6 weeks for Adley Rutschman. So you kind of weather the storm to that point. You don't risk, Basayo's long-term development and risk rushing him too early to have the struggles like Jackson Holliday did last year.
Right, and I think you're 100% right, where it's at this point in time, I just don't think that Tony Mansolino and Mike Elias just don't want to force it. And Mansolino said initially he's a really huge development guy, and just to get you have to be able to give Basayo some consistent reps at the big leagues if you are going to force it right now. And he wouldn't be getting that because Adley is, like you mentioned, is probably only 4 to 6 weeks. And at that point, you're not really giving Basayo that much time. The All-Star break takes into account there as well, because then there's a drop in momentum and consistency there. So you wouldn't necessarily have that much time to give Basayo the amount of time to prove himself. And they are definitely kind of trying to not make the same mistake as what they did with Holliday. And we see all the time with these top prospects in the organization take a lot of multiple stints to be able to show through how they were and with the numbers that they were showing in AAA. We saw it with Cowser, we saw it with Gunnar, we saw it with Adley. So Holliday is not the only one, but Basayo's numbers, it is easy to overlook the fact that he is 20 years old because a lot of his numbers, his average exit velocity, his 90th percentile exit velocity compare with some of the best big league hitters. So it is easy to forget the fact that he's 20, but Tim Fedorovich hit the nail on the coffin where he said, look, you got to remember he's 20 years old, and especially as a catcher, you just have a much heavier workload as a catcher where you have that leadership ability. You are calling the game. And I think that if you did force the growth and development a little bit with Basayo, it's even worse as a catcher where you might not necessarily have the confidence. And I don't know what Basayo's confidence levels are. I'm sure they're high just given his numbers, but I just think it would change drastically if he was thrown into this situation where now, okay, you're catching your first big league game, but you've only had 16 appearances as a catcher in AAA this season. So it's definitely a fine line, but I think they're making the right call by not stunting the growth right now.
The priority is his long-term development. And for Basayo, too, he's gotten a lot of work at first base, too. The Orioles clearly see him as somebody who, if he's not catching, he's athletic enough to be a first baseman. Like, we have seen him go, full splits at first base. Like, that's a dude who is athletic and he can play that position as well. So you want the defense to continue to come along. He has only caught 17 games in his, AAA season this year. So let's pump the brakes a little bit on Samuel Basayo. I know the offensive numbers are outstanding, but there really wasn't ever a doubt that the offensive numbers would be outstanding.
Right.
You just need the defense to continue to come along. So we will see when that time comes for Samuel Basayo. I would imagine it is at some point this season, but the Orioles are not going to rush him just because there is an injury. But Annie, you mentioned your conversation with Tim Fedorovich, the AAA Norfolk new manager after Buck Britton was promoted this season up to the big league staff. Just what other interesting things did you learn from your trip to Norfolk, and, give us the spark notes here.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say he seems like a really great guy, a really level-headed guy, which I think is what you need as a manager. He also has a very lengthy career going up and down the big leagues and the minor leagues. So I think that he is the perfect person to be able to relate to guys like Heston Kjerstad, who is there right now. And I asked him what they've been working on. I know it's only been since June 10th that he was optioned down, but they said right now they're just kind of getting him into a better position to hit, leveling out his shoulders as he strides, and working through some different stances. So that he mentioned that they were tinkering there, which obviously Kjerstad needed a bit of a reset, which was the part of the main reason why he was optioned down. And then another interesting thing, we talked about Dylan Beavers, who luckily has avoided the injured list. He had a really scary collision as well. Lots of collisions happening lately, but he had a collision with Jordan Adams in the outfield not too long ago, but he avoided the IL. He should be back either today or tomorrow into the lineup. But it was very interesting to hear Fedorovich's perspective on why he has been doing so well on offense this season, kind of opposite to Basayo, where this guy isn't very aggressive at the plate. He tends to wait for the perfect pitches to come to him, but he started to get a little bit more aggressive since the beginning of the season, and that's why we're seeing such great numbers from him right now.
Yeah, Dylan Beavers, I think, is somebody who has been putting up outstanding numbers offensively. The conversation with Beavers is always, man, that swing is weird, but it just works for him. And I think throughout his minor league career, he has just figured out, there's mechanical tweaks here and there, and there's things to adjust, but he's just hitting like himself. And the uptick in aggression has led to some great offensive numbers. He's got great speed. He's a good defensive outfielder. He's somebody who, I think if there was probably one more injury in the Orioles outfield, which would have been hard to imagine, he's probably the next call. And who knows if he is the next call at this point between him and Heston Kjerstad. I know Kjerstad, as you mentioned, is down at that level, trying to get a reset a little bit. Obviously, Beavers has not returned to action yet. But I think Beavers developing the way that he has this season is a really encouraging development at AAA, where now that's somebody where there's not a natural spot for him at this point in the big leagues, because you have 4 outfielders at least that are going to get close to everyday playing time. But Beavers is certainly working his way into that conversation.
Yeah, and it also helps, too, when you have a lot of big league guys like Kauser and Westberg and Mullins and Laureano coming down and making rehab stints too. So it really helps with his development in terms of having those conversations with those guys, and even AAA pitchers like Trevor Rogers having those conversations with people who have spent time in the big leagues going up against them, just learning insight. And he mentioned that his time at Major League Camp this year in spring training helped a lot as well. So he is also one of those guys that is starting to break down the wall between minor leagues and making it to the big leagues. Who knows how much time it'll take. I think Heston Kjerstad is probably going to take a little bit more time, just given that the numbers haven't even translated to AAA yet. So, but those two are probably the ones that I would anticipate coming up next.
Yeah, I think so as well. I mean, Heston Kjerstad, I think it's a valuable time for him to be able to make some mechanical adjustments down there. Play every day. Hopefully he stays healthy at AAA Norfolk. There have been, a few freak things here and there that have kept him out. So excited to see Kjerstad get a reset down there. And, he's more than likely going to be back up at the big league level at some point this season. But I think that'll just about do it for this week's edition of the Bird's Nest. Annie, you have braved Barnes & Noble. Thank you for joining us from whatever section of that lovely bookstore you are in.
Thank you. As long as I can get out of the 100-degree heat, then I am just okay.
Yeah, that'll do for both of us here. If we are in air conditioning and not in the 100 degrees, that's a win. So the Orioles continue their homestand here against the Texas Rangers, the rubber match tonight, and hopefully they will stay cool and keep the winning streak going, stay hot on that side of things rather than, the heat at 100 degrees here. But that'll just about do it for this week's edition of the Bird's Nest. Big thank you for following us along here on our YouTube and Facebook channels. We are live close to 11 a.m. most Wednesdays here, maybe in the studio, maybe elsewhere, maybe from a Barnes & Noble. You never know. Or you can catch us after the fact on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us here on the Bird's Nest. Big thank you to Amy Jennings behind the scenes for producing this one. For Annie Klaff, I am Brendan Mortensen, and we'll catch you next time.